Hey everybody, this is Birch, and we've got a viewer mail here talking about manga, U.S. comics, cultural differences, all the rest. The manga versus U.S. comics debate right now, to me, is a little frustrating because it tends to it's just boiled down to really basic parts of itself, and I think a lot of people are missing some pretty interesting parts of the conversation. Or the topic of the debate, or whatever you want to call it. It's really just woke versus non woke is what U.S. comics versus manga storytelling has kind of devolved to. And to be honest, I mean that topic has worn itself to death. So but I'm more interested in kind of looking into more of the other aspects of manga. This kind of gets us there. So this viewer writes, "Hey Purge, with manga becoming the major sequential art cultural force in the U.S. and the general Western world, I've been wondering about how that happened. It wouldn't be a big stretch to say that, in general, manga has a very different visual and storytelling language to a lot of Western comics. From the obvious differences, like art style and direction one would normally read the comic, to the more subtle things like dialogue and storytelling disparities between our cultures, the two forms of comics have as many differences as similarities. Arguably more differences, in a lot of ways. Why do you think the West so eagerly grabbed onto manga, and why do you think the opposite doesn't happen? Aside from some French and Belgium comics, I don't recall hearing much about Western comics being a big cultural force over there, over in Japan. Does Japan have less of a thirst for US style superhero comics? And if so, is it hard for Western indie publishers who make more diverse material to get a sales foothold in that country? Are Western style heroes' journey plots just uninteresting to Japanese audiences raised on different myths and storytelling techniques? Is it just a general lack of initiative from comic publishers to find a solid way to market themselves in Japan? Thanks for reading. Figured since you're a person who reads both and has spent significant time in Japan, you might have a perspective on this. And if you're ever in the UK, I'll buy you a beer. Well, I'll buy you a beer too. I hope to be in the UK actually in a couple months. So it's a good question. There's a lot to dig in here. And the biggest thing I think I would say is that there is not a single answer. There's not one thing. And I think a lot of people get themselves into trouble by, saying, well, it's just this, there's just one reason. It's just one reason why comics have, succeeded or why there's been differences. There's only one cause. And it's just not true. There are many. The reality is, you know, well, okay. So, I mean, let's dig into what some of those are. So, first and foremost, and they all may have different reasons behind them. There may be different. It's a combination of a lot of these elements. I think people could debate which one is the important one and which one is not. But one of the biggest ones is that the Japanese or the American publishers, the Western comic publishers, have not really made a good effort to get into Japan. Now, closely attached to that. Japan is a hard market to get into. If you're not a Japanese company, it is difficult. There are a lot of cultural reasons, business reasons. It is just difficult to go and do business there. The country, I think, protects slash pride slash just makes it difficult for U.S. companies to gain a foothold. There's definitely a preferential treatment for Japan businesses. In many countries, by the way, this is true. It's one reason why you kind of chuckle a little bit when during the last election cycle, Trump was really pushing the America First kind of mentality around goods and manufacturing and all that kind of stuff. And people were like just outraged. This is the most xenophobic, insane, racist, horrible, blah, 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 blah thing. But you can pretty much go anywhere else in the world. And the aspects that of put your country first in terms of manufacturing, all that, pretty common. Definitely true in Japan, absolutely true in China. You'll see it in India. You'll see tons of markets. South America, Europe. There's definitely that aspect of kind of nationalism to our own products, goods, and services. So, this is one of those areas where people will say, nowhere else in the world is there this kind of xenophobia. There's this kind of putting yourself first kind of mentality. No, actually, everywhere else in the world, it's truthfully, I don't know, go travel. You get a different answer in a hurry. But regardless of all that, it is difficult to get in and go and do business in Japan. And on top of that, the Western companies just have not made an effort. I mean, bluntly, there really has not been significant outreach to those markets. And I guess more importantly, it's got to be a combination of outreach plus a willingness to adapt your content for that audience. So, look at the manga that's come into the U.S. There's a couple things you might notice about it. It is packaged differently from how you see it in Japan. There is a little bit more marketing and other stuff attached to it. It's also translated. It's not just in Japanese. You can certainly find some of that manga, but you have to go out of your way. And if right now all of the manga being produced over here was all Japanese and you kind of had to figure it out yourself, it wouldn't be taking off. It's translated, and so it works. The same has not always been true in reverse. I know people at Marvel specifically, and I've heard that it's true of DC, but I've heard firsthand at Marvel that the idea of like translating over in Japanese is just, it's a big pain in the ass, too hard. We never make a profit, just very difficult, blah, and so on. But there is more. So I mean, other things that kind of factor into here. The format. So I mean, the comic to price format would be a real struggle in Japan. They're used to kind of a lot more content for a lot cheaper price. They're used to very seamless digital experiences. That's what works in that market, neither of which really exists here in the U.S. or on any serious level. So that's another barrier to entry. I think that the storytelling technique, in many ways, in my opinion anyway, the content itself, and this gets into the is it woke, is it not woke, is actually one of the smaller differences because, as mentioned, there's plenty of manga, there's plenty of content in Japan that does fairly well, that is a woke, quote unquote woke. Now, what woke is kind of depends on your perspective of it. But if you're talking about kind of social justice type actions, those wouldn't translate well to Japan. Some of the, like that Young Justice comic where they're really railing against racism and sexism, misogyny, and those kind of stuff. First of all, you're in for a tough time if you're going to try and lecture people in a comic about misogyny in Japan. It's not gonna work real well. Not gonna get a lot of traction with that one. Likewise, racism. I mean, these concepts are different there. I mean, unless you're blatantly making fun of the Chinese, racism as a concept in Japan, in the fiction like that, just it'll be confusing and likely people will struggle with it. There's aspects of those topics that come up in comics, but not really. The one that wouldn't be a factor is just LGBTQ type content that has a foothold in Japan. It's got a market, but let's see, what's the best way to describe this? You would have to market it in the genre it's in. You would have to say this is LGBTQ, BL, whatever types, content. That's the genre we're having here. If you go in there and say, hey, this is mainstream, Gojin, shonen. If this is a superhero type comic that you're putting out here, and then you start reading it, and it's really hammering the slice of life type material. You put it this way, I guess. Almost anything can sell in Japan, as long as it's marketed and categorized right. If it's not, it tends to be confusing and ignored, and I think that's another kind of major factor there. So the other kind of thing is the storytelling itself. So somebody was mentioning this as a theory, and I thought about it for a while. I think it is correct, but the art and storytelling of a lot of manga tends to be more visual, kind of panel based. There's not massive amounts of word vomit on the page. Now that certainly there is plenty of dialogue, but the way the storytelling is done is a lot more show, not tell. And that's a pretty major difference, I think, particularly in comics that are out today from the major Western publishers, is they've really gotten into this habit of almost deprioritizing the artist and talking through a lot of the action or not even showing the action. And it's popular in any genre, by the way, even the slice of life stuff. If you look side by side, panel by panel, you'll see that there's a lot more kind of dynamic action, even in slice of life. There's a lot of imagery that kind of tells the story, as opposed to a panel where somebody is talking at you. In all the genres of manga, that is pretty consistent. Just constant dialogue is deprioritized for sure. So I think that there's a factor there of just if you're going to try and bring Western comics over to Japan, that's going to be a hurdle for you to get over. It's just it's gonna play weird over in that market. Look, I mean, in general, I think it comes down to I don't believe that the Western publishers view that market as interesting or viable or one they want to really put effort into chasing. There's, in many ways, if you start to talk to, somebody at the big two and even a lot of the, smaller publishers, they will immediately launch into a lot of reasons why it wouldn't work, why it's difficult, why the market is heavy. I can't find a distributor over there. Can't find, they don't think about things the same way. There's just a million reasons why it can't be done. And when you really try and when you look at some of those reasons, you try and peel them back a little bit. Most of them do not hold up. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent, where the belief is like, the comic will never work over there, so we don't even try. But the reality is, just like Viz has done, if Marvel partnered up with somebody to take some of the key runs from put this way, the Mark Grunwald run of Captain America would probably play really well in Japan. You get it translated, you put it over there in a kind of a reasonable fashion. I think that would most likely sell fairly well. I think that there's a lot of reluctance on the part of both Marvel and DC. Dan Didio said it out loud. There is this frustration with this idea that older comics will sell well or perform better in certain markets than newer comics. It's like, I think people don't want to admit that, hey, what came before is more appropriate for certain areas. They just don't want to admit that. And so I think you get a lot of factor there. But anyway, good question. Thanks very much for writing. What are there's a million more reasons, by the way, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Like and subscribe, of course, as always, and thanks for listening.